The president is threatening to shut down the southern border after a protest Sunday spiraled out of control. Today, Mexico is pledging to strengthen its security at the U.S. border, where more than 5,000 migrants have been camped out in Tijuana, waiting for an opportunity to seek asylum in the United States. This comes after protests took a dramatic turn yesterday and hundreds tried to rush the border. U.S. agents fired tear gas into Mexico to stop them from crossing illegally into the United States. The president is back in Washington today after a holiday weekend at Mar-a-Lago. This morning he tweeted Mexico should deport the migrants back to their countries. He also renewed his call for a wall. Mireya Villarreal has more.
That's the sound of tear gas being fired at migrants Sunday after they rushed the border between San Diego and Tijuana, Mexico. They started throwing tear gas at us. This migrant from Honduras said there were many children who fainted. Video from a Mexican news channel appears to show a Border Patrol agent yelling at migrants nearing the border to get back. He then fires rubber bullets and people scatter. It was like something out of a movie, this migrant woman said. Everyone started running. Mexico's Interior Ministry said around 500 migrants tried to violently enter the U.S. Sunday. U.S. authorities claimed some of the migrants threw rocks and other projectiles at U.S. Customs and Border Patrol. In recent weeks, thousands of mostly Central American migrants have arrived in Tijuana by caravan. More than 5,000 migrants have been camped out in and around a sports complex, hoping to soon seek asylum in the U.S. But fewer than 100 asylum petitions are being processed at the San Isidro port of entry a day. After clashes near the official port of entry yesterday, it was quickly closed in both directions by border agents. An unusual move at the end of a busy holiday weekend. People on foot and in cars waited in long lines for several hours. Late Sunday night, the port was reopened, and as cars began filing in, people cheered.
And joining me now for more on this is White House columnist for The Hill, Niall Stanage. Niall, so great to have you with us. What does the Trump administration want to see happen at the southern border? What is the end game with border shutdown threats?
I don't think it's entirely clear because, frankly, the suggestion of closing the border permanently is bluster, Tanya. As a practical matter, that's not going to happen. The Department of State's own estimates put the figure for trade on a daily basis as $1.7 billion, notes that hundreds of thousands of people cross the border legally. It is worth stressing, I think, also that people have the right to ask for asylum. The problem, as was alluded to in the report you just played, is that there is this delay time in processing those claims. To very many people, it would seem that the problem could perhaps be resolved better by hiring more people to process those claims quicker. Then you could resolve this by people with pen and paper rather than with tear gas canisters.
And Niall, the president tweeted demanding wall funding. There are several looming government funding deadlines coming up. Could the Trump administration use this as leverage?
It could try to do so. It certainly has been pointing in that way. The president wants about $5 billion for border wall funding. The problem is that he may be overstating his leverage. Democrats clearly don't want a border wall, don't certainly want to give $5 billion for it, and they're coming off, obviously, the success in the midterm elections. So the president's idea that the victors are going to sink to their knees as if vanquished seems unlikely to me.
And Niall, does it make any difference that this is the president's last chance to demand wall funding from Congress before Democrats take over the House come January?
Some of his allies have suggested that. Mark Meadows, a congressman and very prominent person in the Freedom Caucus, has put this as being a now or never proposition. But the problem is that ultimately there will need to be some level of bipartisanship involved in this issue, and I just don't see what the motivation would be on Democrats' behalf to move toward the president on this most divisive of issues.
Right, and to that point, Niall, you wrote that the White House believes it will be on Democrats to determine how much gets done come January. You know, they don't see it that way, though. So what is the White House's argument, and is this attempt to be a pressure tactic?
It is to some degree, I think. The White House is arguing that aside from tax cuts, which are traditionally a Republican priority, that there are other areas where there could be bipartisan agreement. They talk about things like pricing for pharmaceuticals. They talk about things like infrastructure spending. There could, at least in theory, be an agreement on those things. Certainly there are Democrats, including people on the left of the party, who are very eager to see infrastructure spending. The question is, though, in as polarised a moment as we're in right now, can there be agreement on the nuts and bolts of these kinds of issues, rather than just noble-sounding words about how we would like to come to an agreement?
Right, that will remain to be seen. And Niall, meanwhile, as we reported earlier, GM announced today it will be cutting nearly 15,000 jobs, possibly closing 5 North American plants, while also increasing production at 2 plants outside of North America. As you know, the president has been promising to help move more jobs to the U.S. and even pass that massive corporate tax cut. So how will this impact his messaging to American workers?
The key point, I think, is the emotional resonance of this. Job losses on such a scale right in the middle of the holiday period. And also, the president has made a big deal of manufacturing jobs specifically. The fact that those are going to be lost in areas that were his heartland, such as northeast Ohio and Michigan, that's a problem for him. I think sometimes the president's defenders have a point when they look at other issues and say they might not have that much impact, when we in the media complain about his Twitter tone or the finer points of the Mueller investigation. But when you're talking about people in those areas wondering how they're perhaps going to pay for Christmas gifts for their kids, that's a different situation, and that, I think, is more politically perilous for the president.
And GM has also been dealing with higher costs associated with tariffs on steel. So some of that is part of the president's policy. Could this announcement then have an impact on how the Trump administration moves forward with potentially more tariffs in the future?
It could do, or it could certainly change the political climate around those tariffs. GM, before they had made this announcement, had objected quite vociferously to the tariffs that have already been put in place. The president had presented those tariffs as something that would protect American jobs. If the evidence before people's eyes is pointing in the opposite direction, then that greatly complicates the tariffs issue for the administration.
Niall Stanage of The Hill, thank you so much.
Thanks, Tanya.